I just want to touch on something you said, because you talked about something that I think about.
Yeah.
This transition to a new financial system
Right.
is something that's worried me a lot. It's something I've thought about a lot because I haven't seen anyone really map it out.
Sure.
What is this transition? What does it mean? And obviously there's multiple outcomes. Bitcoin sits alongside fiat currencies. Fiat currencies become a little bit more, maybe government policy becomes a little bit more responsible.
Yeah.
Maybe the size of government shrinks because they can't spend the way they've spent, but it still sits there alongside fiat currencies.
Yeah.
But there is a scenario where Bitcoin ends up replacing fiat currencies that some people have considered.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a considerable transfer of wealth if that happens.
Sure.
And all types of people are going to be affected in all types of different ways. And it could be a chaotic and bloody transition.
Yeah.
And one I've tried to think through but haven't been able to map out, but just does make me nervous. Not that I don't, it doesn't even matter what I think.
Yeah.
It'll either happen or it won't. But when it does happen, how do we best prepare for that transition? And how do we as people try and help each other through that transition?
Right.
How much time have you spent thinking that through?
I mean, some. I don't probably have all of the answers that you want.
Okay.
But and you said a lot of people. The truth, it will affect everyone, right? It can't not if it goes that way. And it's true. Like the transition could be difficult. And here's here's the way that actually I get through this, right? Like an hour ago, automatically on my phone, I bought 55 cents worth of Bitcoin, right? It happens automatically. You can't buy 55 cents worth of a house. You can't buy 55 cents worth of Apple stock or something. And so there's an opportunity to get people onboarded in a way that is not prohibitive and can actually allow people who even don't have a lot of means right now probably pretty quickly save up to their average share of Bitcoin. Like if you buy 21 million by the population, it's not hard to get to that point now. And you don't need a ton of resources to do that. And so getting as many people as possible to do that is one key. And it's also true that, our current system means that the more money you have right now, the more influence you have about how money works and how much money you get and all of that stuff. And I just don't worry as much about Bitcoin in terms of the people who have a lot of money. And certainly there will be some in Bitcoin terms who have a lot. They don't get to influence the protocol. They don't get to change it to be more beneficial towards them. And so really the secret, hopefully, is to just get as many people educated about it as possible. And your two, sort of paths are absolutely true, right? We could be in a world within our lifetime where Bitcoin is the thing, and it happened without even realizing it. Most people will just look around one day like, oh yeah, Bitcoin is everywhere, right? It's the thing. Or there's I think a less likely option where the government has a check on it now, right? There's a competition and a better kind of money, and so the government and the fiat money exists. But in a checked way, right? There's actually a way to keep it operating well. And either one of those is better than what we have now, I think. As long as we can transition slowly, right? That's my dream, right? Is that all of a sudden our economy doesn't collapse and we don't go into a huge amount of turmoil and people just look around. I was thinking about this the other day. There was a moment in which I looked around many years ago and said, oh, everybody is on their phone and they're looking at it. And that's just the way it is now. And that wasn't like that. And I couldn't pinpoint the moment that happened, right? It all of a sudden, that change shifts, right? And I think that is the best case for Bitcoin, right? In however many years, people all of a sudden they just sort of, oh yeah, look, Bitcoin is in the rails of my bank or in the apps that I'm using or in my paycheck. And it just sort of happens without people realizing it. That's the best case.
Well, we've already had one of those transitions for Bitcoin now where you just don't meet people who haven't heard of it.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure if you go, maybe to the jungle in Brazil and you find some tribe, they will. But there's never a scenario where I get in an Uber and I'm talking to the driver and he says, what are you doing? And I say, I've got a Bitcoin podcast. And he's like, well, what is Bitcoin? They're like, that's that thing.
Yeah.
But you just don't meet people anymore. So at some point, we've transitioned to a world where everyone has pretty much heard of it.
Right.
They don't necessarily understand what it is, but that's no small thing.
No,
right?
no, it's huge. It's huge, right? Because I mean, like everyone else, I had my false start introduction to Bitcoin too, right? Like I heard of it,
Yeah.
I didn't have a conviction, and you go back and you kick yourself, right? Like, oh, it was 2012, and I could have.
Yeah, I know.
But you're right. Everyone's heard of it now, and what's not surprising, but a problem is that a lot of people who've heard of it think that they know what it is. They think they understand what the pros and cons are, but they just haven't had the time or the reason to look into it. Right? A lot of the people I interact with, I'm in the States, and there's just not as much of a reason to like. There's not much urgent reason to really dig into it yet.
Well, it's not. There's not as much of a need for people to have Bitcoin here. The same in the UK,
right?
Same in Germany. There is a need, but
yeah.
It's not like the need that people have in other countries.
Right.
With the high double-digit, triple-digit inflation, people are living under authoritarian regimes. Yeah, there's and I found with going to places like that, people naturally get it more because,
right.
I guess we've never had that urgent need to understand money, even with inflation rate 2-3%, even with all the fuckery from the government. Life from day to day doesn't change that drastically. But when I went to Venezuela, that's not the case. Your money is melting in front of you, and people naturally had to find a way to store their money. That's why they use 5 different currencies there. That's why people want the dollar, because the bolivar is junk.
Yeah.
So they had a reason to discover it.
Right.
So it's a little bit harder to try and convince people.
Yeah, I mean, and there are reasons why somebody who lives in a developed Western country would want it and need it. The use case is completely different from somebody who's living in a place where their bank account could get frozen immediately, or aid going to that country gets skimmed off the top. Like there's lots of reasons. There's just different reasons, and I think that the thing that gives me hope is that we, like in America or England or wherever else, we will need it for sure. And one of my friends said, "Yeah, I'm worried about Bitcoin because I don't think that people are bright enough or like dedicated, or they don't have the technical knowledge to understand it, and it can never take off because what if people just don't get it?" And the beautiful thing is that you don't need to necessarily understand why something is better money to gravitate towards it, right? As you're saying in the Venezuela example, right? Like if you have money that's broken, then you will find something else, and you'll find the better thing. And you don't need to know what a BIP is, and you don't need to know what the mempool is. You'll figure it out. And so I have faith in our ability, sort of as a society and in our government or in our country, to make that transition in that way, because we're on the same curve as Venezuela. We're just in a different spot. So,
yeah, some people find that hard to believe.
I've never, I've never really understood inflation until I really started looking into Bitcoin. I remember when I started learning about Bitcoin, they're always going on and on about inflation. It's not a big deal. It probably hurts rich people more than it hurts poor people. Like all of that stuff is all wrong. And we can go into as details about that if we want.
Did you listen to my interview with Ovik Roy?
I did, yeah. And it was fascinating, right? Because it's not just the compounding effect, right? Like you have inflation is going to compound and hurt people who are more vulnerable and less wealthy. But it's just the sheer fact that if you have somebody who's struggling day to day to get by, week to week, paycheck to paycheck, 100% of what they are bringing in needs to go towards like necessities. And so if everything is more expensive, then you don't have any choices. You just have to spend more on those things, or you have to make choices about what not to buy. And an affluent person doesn't need to do that. They're not spending 100% of their salary or their income on food and shelter. They get choices about where they put their money. And so it just, Avik, your interview with him and the article that you were talking about was absolutely fascinating, because you have these vulnerable people out there. And even if you want to give the Fed, some sort of credit and say, oh, well, we're targeting 2%, and that's not a big deal. Well, it really is. Like that is a big deal for people over a span of time. And the fact that we're not at 2% right now, over 9 is a huge deal. And it's not something that I've had to deal with in my adult life, right? Like I've not had a job and had to pay for things and deal with 9% inflation, right? That's not a problem that we've ever had to deal with. So it's new.
And there's another consideration with that. We were at this meetup last night, and I was on a panel, and somebody said, they asked me about my children, my consideration for my children. And it just kind of clicked for me in that moment that when Ovik talks about this compounding impact on the poor, even 2% doesn't feel too much, but year after year after year, it makes a huge difference. This inflation has a compounding impact on children. So anyone with children just needs to be aware that, if that child's going to spend probably like up to 18 years with you, but perhaps you're going to be supporting them at college afterwards. You might be supporting them for 25 years. Yeah. Now, if you're not affluent and, maybe you're middle class, lower class, but if you're not, affluent, you might not be somebody who's able to leave particular assets for your children. And even if you want to, at the point where they're leaving, school or university and want to get on the housing ladder and start life for themselves, over that 25 years, they have no assets. So it has a compounding impact on their start in life, which is something I hadn't even considered.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's happening everywhere all at once. Nobody who's starting out in life right now can afford to buy a home if they're starting on their own, right? Unless they have some sort of help. And I think it's clear that problem has gotten worse. And of course, this all ties into the money, and it has a connection to Bitcoin, obviously, because you have, you're holding on to money and it's melting away. What do you do with it? You have to buy an appreciating asset, right? So there's a lot of people who don't need houses because they already have a couple, who are buying homes, or corporations who are buying homes, who have no real reason to buy homes except that they're trying to preserve their monetary value.
Well, it's a bit more than that. Someone like a BlackRock, they have access to capital at such a low rate that they can go and buy the scarce asset.
Sure.
The properties have been, I think I'm saying BlackRock, I'm not sure it's them, but I'm pretty sure they've bought tens of thousands of homes.
Yeah. No, it's true.
It is BlackRock.
It's BlackRock.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the big hedge funds do it. But
can you find out how many homes BlackRock owns?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure they're started under the One West thing with Mnuchin.
Yeah.
There was like big transitional wealth from homeowners to BlackRock.
Right. No, and it's true, right? Because if you don't have any good options, what do you do, right? And, I remember talking with friends of mine, right? Like, oh, so-and-so, some famous football player just bought this ridiculous house. And it's like...
it says here about 80,000.
So BlackRock owns 80,000 homes.
That's what it says here.
What's the article?
It's in The Atlantic. That's of June 2021 as well. So
they probably got like
slightly more.
150,000 homes now.
And every home they buy is one less home available to somebody who needs it, and it drives the prices up for the houses that they don't buy. And it's impossible to get a start, right? This is where people look at the system and they're like, this system is not working for me. Like I can even go to college and work really hard and get a good job, and I still can't afford a house.
Yeah, so you don't have to be a progressive to realize this. You could just have to be a reasonable person to understand that we live in a system of money,
right?
And in that system of money, that certain people have more access to capital, and with more access to capital at such a low interest rate, they can go and buy up the properties.
Yeah,
and that takes it's just not a fair system.
It's not a fair system, and again, like this goes back to my point. I'm not trying to convince like, oh, if you believe that BlackRock buying homes is unfair, then you need to be voting for Democrats or something. That's not true. But there are a lot of people out there who are voting for Democrats who know that there's a problem but can't name it.
Yeah.
And that's the target, right? Is say, if I can open up their eyes to have a fuller picture of what the problem is, that's my target audience. I want them to be convinced.